Hello there, dear listeners, and welcome back to Sleepyside Stories. Before we drift into tonight's extraordinary tale, I hope you'll take a moment to settle in wherever you find yourself this evening. How has your day treated you? Perhaps it was filled with the usual carousel of meetings and deadlines, or maybe it unfolded more quietly, like a gentle conversation with an old friend. Whatever shape it took, you've arrived here now, in this peaceful moment we're about to share. If these quiet stories help you unwind from the day's complexities, I'd be so grateful if you'd consider subscribing to our little sanctuary of strange tales. Think of it as joining a circle of curious souls who gather in the gentle darkness to explore the wonderfully peculiar corners of our world. A simple tap of that like button tells me these moments of wonder matter to you, and truly, that means more than you might imagine. Tonight we're venturing into waters both literal and metaphorical, following a brilliant scientist whose quest to chat with dolphins led him through the halls of prestigious universities and into the depths of consciousness itself. This is the story of Dr. John Cunningham Lilly, a man whose perfectly respectable scientific career took a rather spectacular detour through psychedelic experimentation, interspecies romance, and a vision so audacious that it makes Alice's rabbit hole seem like a well-marked nature trail. Our tale begins not in the warm, crystalline waters where dolphins dance through coral gardens, but in the sterile precision of 1950s laboratories, where men in white coats pursued knowledge with the kind of boundless optimism that only comes from having recently split the atom and reached toward the moon. It was an era when anything seemed possible, when science was humanity's brightest torch, and when a brilliant neurophysiologist could reasonably believe that teaching dolphins to speak English was simply a matter of applying sufficient rigour and imagination. John Cunningham Lilly entered this world of infinite scientific possibility on January 6, 1915, in the industrial city of St. Paul, Minnesota. Even as a small child, John displayed the sort of relentless curiosity that would either make him a great scientist or drive his parents to distraction. Fortunately for all concerned, it accomplished both. While other children might wonder why the sky was blue and then forget about it by dinner time, young John would devise elaborate experiments involving mirrors, prisms, and whatever optical equipment he could commandeer from the family medicine cabinet. His parents, both educated and remarkably patient people, quickly recognized that their son possessed what educators politely call special gifts, and what neighbors more accurately describe as an alarming tendency to take apart perfectly good household appliances. They encouraged his scientific bent with the kind of foresight that suggests they may have suspected they were raising either a future Nobel laureate or a future mad scientist. As it turned out, they weren't entirely wrong on either count. John's childhood in Minnesota was marked by the kind of long, harsh winters that force children indoors for months at a time, where they either develop rich inner lives or go slightly stir-crazy. John chose the former option, spending countless hours reading everything he could find about mathematics, physics, and the natural world. He built telescopes from scratch to study the stars, constructed electrical circuits to understand the flow of current, and maintained detailed notebooks filled with observations about everything from ant behavior to cloud formations. These early experiences taught John two crucial lessons that would shape his entire career. First, that the universe was filled with fascinating mysteries waiting to be solved, and second, that the best way to solve them was through careful observation and creative experimentation. He also learned a third, somewhat less scientific lesson, that adults became remarkably nervous when small children started asking questions like, what would happen if we removed a cat's brain and put it in a fish? As John grew older, his interest began to crystallize around what he would later describe as the big questions, the fundamental puzzles of existence that had been keeping philosophers awake at night for millennia. What was consciousness? How did a collection of cells somehow generate thoughts, feelings, and the mysterious sense of being a unique individual looking out at the world? These weren't casual wonderings for young Lilly. They were burning questions that demanded answers through systematic investigation. His academic path was as conventional as his later career would be spectacularly unconventional. John earned his bachelor's degree from the California Institute of Technology in 1938, diving deep into physics and mathematics with the single-minded focus of someone who had found his calling. Caltech in the late 1930s was a hotbed of scientific innovation, where brilliant minds gathered to push the boundaries of human knowledge and occasionally to engage in the sort of elaborate pranks that only highly intelligent people find amusing. The rigorous training at Caltech gave John a deep appreciation for experimental design and quantitative analysis, skills that would serve him well even when he eventually began conducting experiments that would make his former professors wonder if perhaps they had been a bit too encouraging of creative thinking. During his undergraduate years, John was particularly drawn to the emerging field of biophysics, which sought to apply the elegant principles of physics to the messy, complicated world of living organisms. The idea that biological systems could be understood through the same mathematical and experimental approaches used to study inanimate matter struck John as beautifully logical. After all, if the universe operated according to consistent physical laws, surely those same laws governed everything from falling apples to thinking brains. This perspective would later lead him to approach the study of consciousness with the same systematic rigor that other scientists applied to studying the behavior of gases or the motion of planets. It was during his time at Caltech that John first encountered the organ that would fascinate him for the rest of his life, the human brain. In the late 1930s, neuroscience was still very much in its scientific infancy. Researchers were just beginning to understand how neurons communicated through electrical impulses, how different brain regions might control different functions, and how the mysterious phenomenon of consciousness might somehow emerge from 3 pounds of grey tissue that looked, frankly, rather unimpressive when viewed in a laboratory jar. For a young man with John's background in physics and his deep curiosity about the nature of existence, the brain represented the ultimate intellectual challenge. Here was a system of almost incomprehensible complexity, containing billions of interconnected cells that somehow generated thoughts, emotions, memories, and the very sense of self that defined human experience. It was like being presented with the most sophisticated computer ever built, except that no one had bothered to include an instruction manual. After completing his undergraduate studies, John continued his education at the University of Pennsylvania, where he pursued medical training while simultaneously conducting research in neurophysiology. This dual focus perfectly suited his personality. The medical studies provided him with a thorough understanding of human anatomy and physiology, while the research work allowed him to explore the cutting-edge techniques being developed to study brain function. The University of Pennsylvania in the early 1940s was a place where serious young scientists could immerse themselves in the kind of painstaking research that forms the foundation of all scientific progress. John spent countless hours in laboratories, learning to use increasingly sophisticated instruments to measure and analyze the electrical activity of living tissues. This work required extraordinary patience and precision, as the signals being studied were incredibly weak and easily overwhelmed by electrical noise from sources as mundane as nearby electric lights or as exotic as cosmic radiation. John's doctoral research focused on developing new methods for recording neural activity in living animals, a field that required him to become simultaneously a skilled surgeon, an electronics expert, and a patient observer of animal behavior. He spent months perfecting surgical techniques that would allow him to implant electrodes in specific brain regions without causing damage that might interfere with normal function. The work was meticulous, groundbreaking, and utterly respectable by the standards of 1945's neuroscience. But even during these early years, those who worked closely with John noticed something different about his approach to research. While other scientists might be content to study the brain from a purely objective, analytical perspective, John seemed driven by a more personal curiosity about the nature of consciousness itself. He would often spend hours after completing his formal experiments simply observing the animals he was studying, trying to understand not just how their brains worked, but what their subjective experience might actually be like. This philosophical dimension to his scientific work set John apart from many of his contemporaries, though not always in ways that enhanced his professional reputation. While other researchers focused on mapping neural pathways and measuring electrical activity, John found himself wondering about bigger questions. What did it feel like to be a rat navigating a maze? How did a cat's consciousness differ from a human's? Were there forms of awareness in the natural world that humans had never even considered? These were the sorts of questions that made his more conventional colleagues slightly uncomfortable. After all, science was supposed to be objective, focused on measurable phenomena rather than speculative wondering about unmeasurable inner experiences. John's tendency to anthropomorphize his research subjects and to speculate about their subjective states marked him as someone who might be brilliant, but who also might be prone to the kind of woolly thinking that could derail a promising scientific career. After completing his medical degree in 1942, John threw himself into neurophysiology research with the kind of intensity that suggested he had found not just a career, but a calling. The Second World War was raging, and many young scientists were being recruited for military research projects that promised to apply scientific knowledge to practical problems of national importance. John's skills in neurophysiology and his innovative approach to experimental design made him valuable for studies related to human performance under stress, the effects of various environmental conditions on cognitive function, and other areas where neuroscience intersected with the urgent practical concerns of wartime. During the war years, John worked on classified projects that he would rarely discuss in detail later in life, though his colleagues from this period remembered him as someone who brought both rigorous scientific methodology and genuine human concern to studies that might otherwise have been purely technical exercises. He seemed particularly interested in research that might help protect pilots and other military personnel from the psychological stresses of combat, an interest that foreshadowed his later fascination with altered states of consciousness. The war also exposed John to a broader range of human experiences and cultural perspectives than his sheltered academic background had previously provided. He encountered people from different countries, different backgrounds, different ways of understanding the world and humanity's place in it. These experiences began to broaden his conception of consciousness beyond the narrow confines of Western scientific materialism, planting intellectual seeds that would eventually blossom into his later explorations of mystical and transcendent states of awareness. When the war ended, John returned to civilian research with renewed energy and an expanded vision of what neuroscience might accomplish. He established himself at the National Institute of Mental Health, where he continued his pioneering work on neural recording techniques while beginning to explore more ambitious questions about the nature of consciousness and its relationship to brain activity. It was during this period that John developed one of his most famous and enduring contributions to neuroscience, the isolation tank. The concept behind the isolation tank was elegantly simple, which is often the hallmark of truly revolutionary ideas. By placing a person in a tank filled with warm, salty water, dense enough to provide effortless flotation, and by eliminating all light and sound from the environment, John created conditions where external sensory input was reduced to an absolute minimum. The idea was to observe what the human brain did when it was essentially left to its own devices, freed from the constant stream of sensory information that normally occupies our attention. The isolation tank experiments began in the early 1950s, and they immediately yielded results that were both fascinating and slightly unsettling. Subjects reported vivid hallucinations, profound alterations in their sense of time and space, mystical experiences that seemed to transcend ordinary waking awareness, and insights into the nature of their own minds that they had never experienced before. Some described feeling as though they had left their bodies entirely, while others reported encounters with what they could only describe as other forms of consciousness. For John, these weren't just interesting psychological phenomena to be catalogued and filed away in scientific journals. They were windows into the deepest nature of consciousness itself, evidence that human awareness was far more flexible and mysterious than most scientists had ever imagined. The isolation tank became both a research tool and a means of personal exploration, allowing John to study consciousness from both objective and subjective perspectives simultaneously. Word of John's isolation tank experiments began to spread through the scientific community, generating reactions that range from fascination to outright skepticism. Traditional behaviorists argued that consciousness was simply the sum of observable behaviors, and that subjective experiences couldn't be studied scientifically because they couldn't be measured or replicated. Cognitive researchers were intrigued by the possibility of studying pure consciousness separated from external stimuli, but many remained suspicious of reports that seemed to venture into mystical territory. John himself became a regular subject in his own isolation tank experiments, spending hours floating in the dark, silent water while carefully observing the changes in his own consciousness. These personal explorations convinced him that ordinary waking awareness represented only a tiny fraction of the mind's potential, that there were vast territories of consciousness that remained completely unexplored by conventional psychology. He began to develop theories about different levels or states of consciousness, ideas that would eventually lead him far beyond the boundaries of respectable neuroscience. As the 1950s progressed, John's reputation as an innovative neuroscientist continued to grow within certain circles, even as his research interests began to drift toward areas that made his more conservative colleagues nervous. His technical contributions to the field were substantial and widely respected. He had developed new surgical techniques for implanting electrodes in living brains, created improved methods for recording neural activity, and published influential papers on the electrical basis of brain function. By any conventional measure, he was a successful and increasingly prominent member of the scientific establishment. But John's mind was increasingly turning toward questions that lay at the very edges of scientific respectability, and sometimes beyond them entirely. If consciousness could be so dramatically altered by simple sensory deprivation, what did that suggest about the nature of reality itself? If the brain was capable of generating experiences that seemed to transcend ordinary physical existence, what were the implications for understanding the relationship between mind and matter? And perhaps most intriguingly of all, if human consciousness was so malleable and mysterious, what might consciousness be like in other species? This last question would prove to be the one that transformed John Lilly from a respected neurophysiologist into one of the most controversial scientists of his generation. His interest in animal consciousness began practically enough, arising from his work with the United States Navy on projects related to underwater acoustics and marine mammal behavior. The Navy was interested in understanding how dolphins and whales navigated and communicated in their aquatic environment, hoping to apply these insights to the development of improved sonar systems and underwater detection equipment. But John's first close encounters with dolphins convinced him that these remarkable creatures represented something far more significant than just another research subject for military applications. During his initial observations at Navy facilities, he was struck by something in the dolphins' behavior that suggested intelligence far beyond what anyone had previously suspected. Their eyes seemed to regard him with unmistakable curiosity and awareness, as though they were studying him with the same intensity that he was bringing to studying them. More remarkably still, the dolphins seemed genuinely interested in the humans who were studying them. Rather than simply tolerating human presence, or responding mechanically to training stimuli, they appeared to be actively engaging with their human observers, initiating interactions and displaying what could only be described as curiosity about these strange, air-breathing visitors to their aquatic world. John watched, fascinated, as dolphins would approach the edges of their pools and float motionlessly, apparently studying the humans with the same scientific interest that the humans were directing toward them. The more time John spent observing dolphins, the more convinced he became that conventional science had dramatically underestimated their cognitive abilities. Their behavior showed clear evidence of problem-solving skills, social cooperation, and what appeared to be emotional responses to various situations. Most intriguingly of all, they seemed to possess a complex communication system that involved not just the clicking and whistling sounds that researchers had previously noted, but also subtle body language, synchronized swimming patterns, and what appeared to be intentional acoustic signals directed specifically at human observers. This realization led John to make what would prove to be one of the most consequential decisions of his career. He would establish a dedicated research facility specifically designed to study dolphin intelligence and communication. The idea was audacious by the standards of 1950s marine biology, which typically focused on more practical matters like fish populations and ocean currents. John was proposing to spend serious money and scientific resources on the assumption that dolphins might be intelligent enough to justify intensive study, an assumption that many of his colleagues considered somewhere between optimistic and delusional. Nevertheless, John's reputation as an innovative neuroscientist and his connections within the research community allowed him to secure funding for what would become the Communication Research Institute, located on the island of St. Thomas in the Virgin Islands. The choice of location was both practical and symbolic. Practical because the warm Caribbean waters provided an ideal environment for maintaining healthy dolphins year-round, and symbolic because the isolation of the islands would allow John and his team to conduct their unconventional research, away from the skeptical eyes of the mainstream scientific establishment. The process of establishing the dolphin laboratory proved to be an education in the unexpected complexities of working with highly intelligent marine mammals. John had assumed, with the touching optimism of someone whose previous research subjects had been laboratory rats and anesthetized cats, that dolphins would behave more or less like large, aquatic versions of conventional experimental animals. This assumption lasted approximately 15 minutes into his first serious attempt to conduct controlled experiments with captive dolphins. The dolphins, it turned out, had their own opinions about how scientific research should be conducted, and these opinions rarely aligned with the carefully planned experimental protocols that John had developed. Where a laboratory rat might dutifully run through a maze in exchange for food pellets, the dolphins would often ignore the experimental apparatus entirely, preferring to engage in elaborate games that seemed designed to test the patience and ingenuity of their human observers, rather than to demonstrate their own cognitive abilities. One particularly memorable early experiment involved an attempt to test dolphin problem-solving abilities using a simple puzzle box containing fish treats. The idea was straightforward. Present the dolphins with a mechanical puzzle that required specific manipulations to open, then observe and document the strategies they used to solve it. John and his assistants spent weeks designing and constructing what they believed was an appropriately challenging but solvable puzzle, then lowered it into the dolphin pool with scientific anticipation. The dolphins examined the puzzle box for approximately 30 seconds, during which time John and his team prepared their recording equipment and observation notes. Then, rather than attempting to solve the puzzle through the intended method of manipulating various levers and switches, one of the dolphins simply grabbed the entire apparatus in its jaws and shook it vigorously until it broke apart, spilling fish treats throughout the pool. The other dolphins immediately joined in what appeared to be a celebratory feast, while John stared at the wreckage of his carefully designed experiment and began to suspect that he might have underestimated his research subjects. This pattern repeated itself with amusing regularity throughout the early days of the Communication Research Institute. Time and again, John and his team would design what they believed were clever experiments to test various aspects of dolphin intelligence, only to discover that the dolphins had their own ideas about how to approach the problems presented to them. Rather than following the logical step-by-step problem-solving strategies that human researchers expected, the dolphins displayed a kind of creative lateral thinking that was both impressive and deeply frustrating for scientists trying to conduct controlled studies. The dolphins also demonstrated an unexpected talent for what could only be described as practical jokes. They seemed to take particular delight in confounding human expectations and disrupting carefully planned procedures. During one experiment designed to test their ability to distinguish between different visual symbols, a dolphin named Elvar learned to splash water at precisely the right moment to obscure the symbols from the underwater cameras, apparently just to see how the researchers would react. When the team repositioned the cameras to avoid the splashing, Elvar promptly developed a technique for creating underwater bubble screens that achieved the same disruptive effect. Another dolphin, Sissy, discovered that she could manipulate the underwater recording equipment by generating specific acoustic signals that interfered with the electronic instruments. Rather than using this ability randomly, she seemed to deploy it strategically during experiments she found boring, effectively expressing her editorial opinion about the quality of the research being conducted. The research team found themselves in the peculiar position of having to negotiate with their experimental subjects about which studies would be permitted to proceed. That achieved the same disruptive effect. Another dolphin, Sissy, discovered that she could manipulate the underwater recording equipment by generating specific acoustic signals that interfered with the electronic instruments. Rather than using this ability randomly, she seemed to deploy it strategically during experiments she found boring, effectively expressing her editorial opinion about the quality of the research being conducted. The research team found themselves in the peculiar position of having to negotiate with their experimental subjects about which studies would be permitted to proceed. These experiences forced John to reconsider his entire approach to dolphin research. Traditional laboratory methods, which relied on controlling variables and eliminating confounding factors, seemed inappropriate for studying creatures that were intelligent enough to actively resist being controlled. Instead, John began developing what he called participant-observer methodology, in which the researchers would essentially join the dolphins' social environment and attempt to understand their behaviour from within their own aquatic world. This shift in methodology reflected John's growing conviction that dolphins possessed not just intelligence, but something approaching consciousness in the full sense that humans understood the term. They weren't simply responding to stimuli according to programmed behavioural patterns. They were thinking, planning, and making decisions based on their own assessment of situations. More remarkably still, they seemed to understand that they were being studied and to have opinions about the research process itself. The implications of this realization were staggering from a scientific perspective. If dolphins truly possessed consciousness comparable to humans, then successful communication with them would represent one of the most significant breakthroughs in the history of science. It would mean that intelligence and self-awareness were not unique to humans, that the universe might be populated with minds capable of abstract thought, artistic expression, and philosophical contemplation. For a scientist like John, who had spent his career studying consciousness from the outside, the possibility of actually communicating with a completely different form of conscious being was irresistibly compelling. But the challenges involved in establishing meaningful communication with dolphins were unlike anything John had encountered in his previous research. How do you establish a common vocabulary with creatures that live in a completely different sensory world? How do you bridge the gap between a species that evolved to navigate three-dimensional space through echolocation and one that developed language to coordinate social behavior on dry land? These weren't simply technical problems that could be solved through better equipment or more sophisticated experimental design. They were fundamental philosophical challenges that required entirely new approaches to the study of consciousness and communication. The cultural context of the 1950s and early 1960s science provided both opportunities and obstacles for John's unconventional research program. On one hand, it was an era of unprecedented scientific optimism when researchers believed that systematic application of scientific method could solve virtually any problem. The same confidence that had led to the development of atomic energy and space exploration seemed to suggest that interspecies communication was simply another frontier waiting to be conquered through sufficient ingenuity and persistence. On the other hand, the scientific establishment of the time was deeply conservative in its methodology and suspicious of research that ventured too far from established protocols. The behaviorist school of psychology, which dominated American research during this period, insisted that consciousness couldn't be studied scientifically because it wasn't directly observable or measurable. From this perspective, John's interest in dolphin consciousness was not just scientifically questionable, but philosophically misguided. The tension between scientific ambition and methodological conservatism created a peculiar environment in which John found himself simultaneously celebrated and marginalized. Popular media embraced his dolphin research with enthusiasm, seeing it as evidence of humanity's expanding scientific horizons and our growing understanding of the natural world. Scientific journals and professional conferences, however, remained skeptical of work that seemed to rely too heavily on subjective interpretation and anthropomorphic speculation. This dichotomy was reflected in the funding landscape that John navigated throughout the early years of his dolphin research. Government agencies and traditional scientific foundations were reluctant to support work that seemed to have strayed so far from conventional neuroscience, but private donors and military research programs showed considerable interest in the potential applications of interspecies communication. The Navy, in particular, was intrigued by the possibility that dolphins might be trained for underwater reconnaissance and detection work, applications that could prove valuable for national security purposes. John found himself walking a delicate line between pursuing his genuine scientific interest in consciousness and communication while satisfying the more practical expectations of his funding sources. Military contracts required him to focus on training dolphins for specific tasks, while his own research goals centered on understanding dolphin intelligence and developing methods for meaningful interspecies dialogue. These different objectives weren't necessarily incompatible, but they required careful navigation to ensure that neither his scientific integrity nor his financial support was compromised. The day-to-day operations of the Communication Research Institute reflected these competing pressures and objectives. The facility included both practical training areas, where dolphins could be taught to perform specific tasks for military applications, and more experimental spaces designed for open-ended communication research. The staff included traditional animal trainers working alongside experimental psychologists, creating a unique interdisciplinary environment that was simultaneously cutting-edge and practical. The dolphins themselves seemed to thrive in this unusual research environment, displaying behaviors that surprised even John with their complexity and apparent intentionality. They learned to perform the practical tasks required by military contracts with remarkable efficiency, but they also engaged in spontaneous behaviors that suggested genuine curiosity about their human caretakers and the strange world of scientific research they had become part of. One of the most intriguing developments during this period was the dolphins' apparent attempts to initiate communication with their human observers. Rather than simply responding to human-initiated interactions, they began approaching researchers and engaging in what could only be described as conversational behavior. They would position themselves at the edges of their pools, making eye contact with specific humans and producing sequences of sounds that had the rhythm and structure of language, even though their meaning remained mysterious. These spontaneous communication attempts convinced John that the dolphins were not just capable of learning human-designed tasks, but were actively interested in establishing some form of meaningful dialogue with their human companions. This observation led him to begin developing more sophisticated approaches to interspecies communication, methods that would allow for genuine two-way exchange rather than simple stimulus-response training. The breakthrough that John had been hoping for came through an unexpected combination of careful observation and serendipitous discovery. While working with a young male dolphin named Peter, John noticed that the animal seemed to be attempting to mimic human vocalizations, producing sounds that bore crude but unmistakable resemblances to specific English words. Unlike simple trained responses, these vocalizations appeared to be Peter's own attempts to bridge the communication gap between species. Peter's vocal experiments were initially dismissed by some members of the research team as coincidental similarities between dolphin sounds and human speech. But John recognized something more significant in the pattern of Peter's vocalizations. They appeared to be intentional attempts at linguistic communication, rather than random acoustic mimicry. Peter seemed to understand that the humans were trying to communicate with him through vocal sounds, and he was attempting to participate in that communication, using the closest approximation to human speech that his physiology would allow. This realization led John to focus his research efforts on developing intensive, one-on-one communication sessions with individual dolphins, particularly Peter, who showed the most promising aptitude for vocal learning. But the logistics of conducting such intensive research presented unprecedented challenges. Traditional laboratory methods, which relied on brief controlled interactions between researchers and subjects, seemed inadequate for the kind of sustained, intimate communication work that would be necessary to achieve meaningful interspecies dialogue. What John needed was a way to create continuous naturalistic interaction between humans and dolphins, an environment where both species could live together and learn each other's communication systems through constant exposure and practice. This insight would lead him to conceive what would become the most famous and most controversial experiment of his entire career, a specially designed facility where a human researcher would actually live with a dolphin, sharing the same space 24 hours a day in an unprecedented experiment in interspecies cohabitation. The Dolphin House, as it came to be known, was an architectural marvel that seemed to exist somewhere between cutting-edge laboratory and elaborate art installation. Located on St. Thomas, the facility had been painstakingly redesigned to accommodate the unprecedented needs of the experiment John had conceived. The main living area was flooded to a depth of about 2 feet, creating an environment where a human researcher could wade through daily routines while dolphins could swim alongside, their dorsal fins occasionally breaking the surface like grey punctuation marks in an ongoing aquatic conversation. The engineering challenges alone were formidable enough to give conventional architects nightmares. How do you create a living space that's simultaneously habitable for air-breathing humans and comfortable for marine mammals? How do you waterproof furniture, electronics, and basic necessities while maintaining an environment that doesn't feel like living inside a swimming pool? The solutions were as creative as they were practical, involving everything from specially designed waterproof mattresses to elevated platforms that allowed for dry storage of essential equipment. The facility included several interconnected rooms, each serving different functions in what John hoped would become a functioning interspecies household. There was a kitchen area where the human researcher could prepare meals while dolphin companions swam curious circles around their legs, undoubtedly wondering why these strange creatures insisted on cooking their food before consuming it. A bedroom featured a waterproof bed positioned just inches above the water level, ensuring that the human occupant could sleep while remaining accessible to their aquatic roommate. A laboratory space contained recording equipment, waterproof notebooks, and various instruments needed to document what everyone hoped would be historic breakthroughs in communication. But perhaps the most remarkable feature of the Dolphin House was its atmosphere of casual intimacy. This wasn't the sterile environment of a traditional laboratory, with its rigid protocols and clinical detachment. Instead, it felt more like an unusual shared apartment, where human and dolphin roommates would navigate the daily rhythms of life together, learning each other's habits, preferences, and peculiarities in the organic way that only comes from truly living alongside another being. Finding the right person to serve as the primary human participant in this unprecedented experiment proved almost as challenging as designing the facility itself. The position required someone with scientific training sufficient to make meaningful observations, physical stamina to live in a partially aquatic environment for extended periods, and psychological flexibility to adapt to what would undoubtedly be a highly unusual living situation. Most importantly, it required someone with the kind of open-minded curiosity that could approach interspecies communication without the preconceptions that might limit more conventional researchers. John found his ideal candidate in Margaret Howe Lovatt, a young woman whose background was as unconventional as the experiment itself. Margaret wasn't a traditionally trained scientist, but she possessed something perhaps more valuable for this particular project: an intuitive understanding of animal behavior and a willingness to embrace the unknown with genuine enthusiasm. She had worked with John on earlier dolphin projects, demonstrating both the scientific curiosity and the emotional resilience that this unprecedented experiment would require. Margaret's appointment as the primary researcher for the Dolphin House project represented a radical departure from conventional scientific methodology. Traditional research protocols emphasized maintaining emotional distance between researchers and subjects, ensuring that personal feelings wouldn't contaminate objective observations. But John's approach deliberately encouraged the development of genuine relationships between human and dolphin participants, recognizing that meaningful communication might only be possible within the context of mutual trust and affection. Margaret moved into this aquatic world in June of 1965, accompanied by a young male dolphin named Peter. The choice of Peter as her cohabitant was based on months of careful observation and evaluation. Unlike the female dolphins at the facility, who tended to be more focused on their own social hierarchies and less interested in sustained human interaction, Peter had shown exceptional curiosity about his human caretakers and appeared genuinely motivated to engage in the kind of intensive relationship that the experiment would require. Peter was, by all accounts, a remarkable individual even by dolphin standards. Standing about 8 feet long and weighing roughly 400 pounds, he possessed the sleek, powerful grace that makes dolphins such compelling subjects for human fascination. But it was his personality that truly set him apart from his fellow dolphins. Where many marine mammals might grow bored with human attempts at communication, Peter seemed endlessly patient with Margaret's efforts to teach him English words and phrases, displaying a level of sustained attention that would have been impressive in a human graduate student. The daily routine that emerged between Margaret and Peter was unlike anything documented in the annals of scientific research, and certainly unlike anything that would ever receive approval from a modern ethics review board. Margaret would wake each morning to find Peter floating nearby, apparently having spent the night in the deeper pool areas, but returning to the shallow living spaces as soon as he sensed his human companion stirring. She would begin each day by greeting him with a series of simple English phrases, trying to establish consistent vocal patterns that might eventually evolve into a shared vocabulary. Breakfast time became an opportunity for structured language lessons, though the term structured might be generous, given Peter's tendency to interpret educational activities as invitations to play. As Margaret prepared her morning meal, she would narrate her actions in simple, repetitive language, holding up objects for Peter to observe while clearly articulating their names. "Margaret is making coffee," she might say, displaying the coffee pot with the kind of theatrical emphasis usually reserved for elementary school teachers. "Coffee is hot. Coffee is brown. Margaret drinks coffee." Peter would respond with a series of clicks, whistles, and increasingly deliberate attempts at vocal mimicry that gradually began to show patterns suggesting genuine understanding rather than simple repetition. The remarkable thing about these interactions was how quickly they evolved from formal lessons into something resembling natural conversation between friends. Despite the artificial nature of their living arrangement, Margaret and Peter developed the kind of easy familiarity that characterizes successful relationships between any two intelligent beings. Peter learned to recognize the sounds that indicated Margaret was about to prepare his food, positioning himself near the feeding area with anticipatory excitement that was both endearing and scientifically significant. Margaret learned to interpret Peter's various vocalizations, understanding when he was bored, when he wanted to play, when he was frustrated by his inability to produce the human sounds he was obviously trying to master. But it was Peter's attempts at human speech that provided the most compelling evidence that something unprecedented was happening in the flooded house. Unlike simple trained responses that might be produced mechanically in response to specific stimuli, Peter's vocalizations showed clear evidence of intentional communication. He would attempt to repeat specific words that Margaret used frequently, particularly her name and basic greeting phrases. His pronunciation was naturally limited by his physiology. Dolphins simply don't possess the same vocal apparatus as humans, but the intentionality behind his efforts was unmistakable to anyone who observed him carefully. Even more remarkably, Peter began to demonstrate what appeared to be genuine language learning rather than mere mimicry. He would use vocal approximations of human words in appropriate contexts, suggesting that he was beginning to understand the relationship between specific sounds and their meanings. When he wanted Margaret's attention, he would produce sounds that bore a clear resemblance to her name. When he was hungry, he would make sounds that approximated the word fish. These weren't perfect reproductions of human speech, but they represented something far more significant, evidence of a non-human intelligence actively working to bridge the communication gap between species. The physical intimacy that developed between Margaret and Peter was perhaps the most scientifically fascinating and socially controversial aspect of the entire experiment. In order to establish the kind of close relationship that John believed was necessary for breakthrough communication, Margaret found herself spending increasing amounts of time in direct physical contact with Peter. She would stroke his skin, scratch behind his fins, and engage in the kind of tactile play that dolphins naturally enjoy with members of their own species. This physical closeness served important scientific purposes that extended far beyond simple affection. Touch is a crucial component of dolphin social behavior, and by engaging in appropriate physical interaction, Margaret was demonstrating her acceptance of Peter as a social partner, rather than simply a research subject. The trust that developed through this physical intimacy seemed to accelerate Peter's language learning, as he became increasingly motivated to communicate with someone he clearly regarded as a friend and companion, rather than merely a provider of food and entertainment. However, this physical relationship created complications that no one had fully anticipated when the experiment was designed. As Peter matured sexually during the months of the experiment, his natural biological urges began to complicate the living arrangement in ways that were both scientifically fascinating and practically problematic. Dolphins, like many intelligent mammals, have complex sexual behaviors, and Peter's attraction to his human companion created situations that required delicate handling to maintain the scientific integrity of the project. Margaret approached these developments with remarkable grace and scientific objectivity that would have impressed even the most demanding research supervisor. Rather than ending the experiment or creating artificial barriers that might damage the trust she had worked so hard to establish with Peter, she found practical and clinical ways to address the situation that allowed the communication work to continue while meeting Peter's biological needs. Her approach was matter-of-fact, professional, and focused entirely on maintaining the relationship that was proving so crucial to the language learning process. Meanwhile, John himself was exploring another avenue of consciousness research that would ultimately transform the dolphin communication work in ways that no one could have predicted. His lifelong fascination with altered states of consciousness, which had led him to develop the isolation tank, was beginning to intersect with the broader cultural revolution that was starting to sweep through American society in the early 1960s. The psychedelic revolution was emerging from university laboratories where researchers like Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert were conducting studies with LSD, a powerful hallucinogenic drug that was still legal and considered a legitimate tool for consciousness research. John, with his deep interest in understanding the nature of awareness and his willingness to use himself as an experimental subject, was naturally drawn to this new field of investigation. John began experimenting with LSD in combination with his isolation tank work, creating unprecedented combinations of sensory deprivation and chemical consciousness alteration. These personal explorations produced experiences that were unlike anything previously documented in scientific literature, convincing him that psychedelic drugs might be powerful tools for expanding consciousness and enhancing communication abilities. If LSD could break down the barriers between different aspects of human consciousness, John reasoned, might it not also break down the barriers between human and dolphin minds? This line of thinking led John to make one of the most controversial decisions of his career. He would incorporate psychedelic drugs into his dolphin communication research. The idea seemed logical within the experimental culture of the 1960s, when the boundaries between legitimate research and radical exploration were constantly being pushed. If consciousness-expanding drugs could enhance human awareness and communication abilities, surely they might facilitate the kind of breakthrough that the Dolphin Project was seeking. John's first experiments with administering LSD to dolphins were conducted with careful medical monitoring and scientific documentation, though by modern standards the entire enterprise would be considered ethically unthinkable. He started with very small doses, observing the dolphins closely for any signs of distress or adverse reactions. What he found both excited and concerned him. The dolphins under the influence of LSD displayed dramatically altered behavior patterns, becoming more vocal, more physically active, and apparently more interested in interacting with their human caretakers. More significantly, from John's perspective, the drugged dolphins seemed to show enhanced abilities in the very areas he was most interested in studying. Their vocal experimentation became more complex and sustained. Their attempts to mimic human sounds became more elaborate and persistent, and they seemed to display increased emotional expressiveness, as if the drug had somehow lowered their inhibitions and allowed their inner lives to become more visible to human observers. These preliminary results were sufficiently encouraging that John decided to incorporate LSD administration into the regular routine at the Dolphin House. Margaret, initially skeptical about introducing drugs into what had been a naturalistic living experiment, eventually agreed to participate in sessions where both she and Peter would be under the influence of LSD simultaneously. The idea was to create a shared altered state that might facilitate unprecedented levels of interspecies communication. The sessions that followed were unlike anything in the history of scientific research, producing experiences that read more like accounts of mystical visions than laboratory reports. Picture, if you will, a young woman and a dolphin, both in chemically altered states of consciousness, floating together in warm, shallow water, attempting to communicate across the vast evolutionary gulf that separates their species. The recordings and notes from these sessions, when they were eventually made public decades later, would challenge conventional understanding of both consciousness and scientific methodology. During these enhanced communication sessions, both Margaret and Peter seemed to experience a breakdown of the normal boundaries that separated their consciousness. Margaret reported feeling as though she could almost understand Peter's thoughts directly, without the need for vocal translation. Peter's behaviour became more human-like in some ways, more expressive and emotionally complex, as if the drug had allowed him to access aspects of his personality that were normally hidden beneath the surface of typical dolphin social conventions. The vocal work during these sessions was particularly remarkable, with Peter's attempts at human speech becoming more sustained and elaborate than anything previously recorded. Margaret's ability to interpret and respond to Peter's natural dolphin vocalizations seemed to be similarly enhanced, leading to extended periods of back-and-forth communication that had the rhythm and flow of genuine conversation, even if the content remained largely mysterious to outside observers. Within just a few weeks of the separation, Peter's health began to deteriorate rapidly in ways that alarmed his new caretakers. He refused to eat regularly, showed little interest in interacting with the staff at his new facility, and displayed behaviour that suggested severe depression. Most alarming of all, he began to exhibit what marine mammal experts would later recognise as self-destructive behaviour, refusing to surface for air at regular intervals and seeming to lose the basic survival instincts that had sustained him throughout his life. News of Peter's death sent shockwaves through both the scientific community and the broader public that had followed the Dolphin House experiment. For those, but even as these remarkable developments were unfolding in the flooded house, storm clouds were gathering in the broader scientific community that would eventually sweep away John's entire research program. The combination of unconventional methodology, psychedelic experimentation, and increasingly sensational media coverage was creating a perfect tempest of professional skepticism that John found increasingly difficult to weather. What had begun as legitimate scientific curiosity about dolphin intelligence was being transformed in the public imagination into something far more exotic and controversial. The scientific establishment's patience with John's unorthodox methods was wearing thin with the persistence of a slow leak in a research grant. Traditional marine biologists and neurophysiologists had always been skeptical of claims about dolphin intelligence that seemed to venture beyond what could be rigorously demonstrated through conventional experimental methods. The introduction of psychedelic drugs into animal research protocols raised red flags that couldn't be ignored, particularly as the broader cultural backlash against LSD was beginning to gain momentum throughout American society. The National Science Foundation, which had provided crucial early support for John's dolphin research, began expressing serious reservations about the direction his work had taken. Foundation administrators found themselves in the uncomfortable position of trying to explain to congressional oversight committees why taxpayer money was being used to give hallucinogenic drugs to dolphins, in what appeared to be increasingly unconventional living arrangements. The bureaucratic appetite for defending such research proved to be considerably smaller than John had anticipated. More personally devastating for John was the growing isolation he felt from his scientific peers. Researchers who had once collaborated with him on neurophysiology projects were now politely declining invitations to visit his laboratory or participate in joint research endeavours. Conference organisers stopped extending speaking invitations for major symposiums, and the prestigious scientific journals that had once eagerly published his work were now subjecting his submissions to increasingly sceptical peer review processes that seemed designed more to discredit than to evaluate. The irony was not lost on John that his most successful experiment in terms of generating compelling evidence for animal intelligence was simultaneously proving to be his professional undoing. The Dolphin House project had produced more detailed documentation of apparent interspecies communication than any previous research, yet the very unconventional methods that had made these breakthroughs possible were now being used to dismiss the entire body of work as unscientific speculation. Margaret found herself caught in an equally difficult position, as word of the Dolphin House experiment began to circulate beyond the immediate scientific community. As the primary researcher who had lived with Peter and documented their remarkable interactions, she possessed months of detailed observations and recordings that represented genuinely unprecedented data about animal communication abilities. Yet she was increasingly aware that the scientific establishment was unlikely to take her work seriously, partly because of the unconventional research methods, and partly because of the growing sensationalization of her relationship with Peter in the popular press. The media attention had become particularly problematic, transforming from legitimate scientific interest into tabloid fascination with the more sensational aspects of the human-dolphin cohabitation experiment. Reporters seemed far more interested in the physical and emotional intimacy between Margaret and Peter than in the linguistic breakthroughs that were actually occurring in their shared living space. Headlines focused on the bizarre nature of their living arrangement, rather than the scientific significance of their communication work, creating a narrative that emphasized sensation over substance. This media distortion created a feedback loop that made serious scientific discourse about the research nearly impossible. The more sensational the press coverage became, the more reluctant legitimate scientists were to associate themselves with John's work. The more isolated John became from the scientific mainstream, the more he was forced to rely on alternative sources of funding and support that often came with their own agendas and expectations, further distancing him from conventional academic respectability. The counterculture movement, which had initially seemed like a blessing for John's consciousness research, was now proving to be something of a double-edged sword. While spiritual seekers and alternative researchers provided emotional and financial support for his work, their interest often focused more on the mystical and transcendent aspects of interspecies communication than on the rigorous scientific documentation that would be necessary to convince skeptical academics. Visitors to the laboratory increasingly arrived not as fellow researchers seeking to understand dolphin intelligence, but as pilgrims hoping for their own transformative encounters with these mysterious marine mammals. The dolphins themselves were beginning to show signs of stress from their prolonged captivity, and the constant stream of human visitors seeking profound experiences. Peter, in particular, seemed to be struggling with the artificial nature of his environment and his isolation from other dolphins. His behavior became increasingly unpredictable, alternating between periods of intense engagement with Margaret and episodes of what could only be described as depression or withdrawal. The emotional toll of living in such an unnatural situation was becoming apparent in ways that troubled even John, despite his conviction that the research justified the sacrifice. The psychological burden on Margaret was also becoming increasingly evident to those who observed her closely. Living in isolation with Peter for months at a time, cut off from normal human social interaction, and constantly immersed in the intense emotional world of interspecies communication, had created strains that she was only beginning to understand. The relationship with Peter had become so central to her daily life that the prospect of separation felt emotionally devastating. Yet she was also aware that the situation couldn't continue indefinitely under the mounting external pressures. John himself was grappling with his own psychological challenges as his lifelong scientific career seemed to be crumbling around him with the slow inevitability of erosion. The isolation tank experiments and psychedelic research that had once seemed like natural extensions of his neurophysiology work were now viewed by many as evidence that he had lost touch with scientific reality. The brilliant researcher who had once been at the forefront of consciousness studies was increasingly seen as a cautionary tale about the dangers of letting personal fascination override scientific rigor. The financial pressures were mounting as relentlessly as the professional ones. The Communication Research Institute, which had been expensive to maintain even under the best circumstances, became financially unsustainable as traditional funding sources dried up like puddles in the Caribbean sun. The specialized equipment needed to maintain the flooded living spaces, the cost of feeding and caring for the dolphins, and the salaries for the research staff all combined to create a financial burden that could no longer be supported through conventional scientific grants. Private funding sources, while sometimes available, often came with strings attached that compromised the scientific integrity of the research. Wealthy patrons interested in consciousness exploration might provide financial support, but they frequently expected access to the dolphins for their own mystical experiences rather than supporting rigorous scientific documentation. Military contracts offered more substantial funding, but they required focusing on practical training applications rather than the pure communication research that remained John's primary interest. The situation was further complicated by growing concerns about the ethics of keeping highly intelligent marine mammals in captivity for extended periods, particularly when that captivity involved experimental drug administration. Animal rights advocates, while still a relatively small voice in the mid-1960s, were beginning to raise questions that would eventually become mainstream concerns about the treatment of captive dolphins. The very intelligence that made dolphins such fascinating research subjects also made their captivity more ethically problematic than traditional laboratory animal research. As 1967 progressed, it became increasingly clear that the Dolphin House experiment would have to end. The convergence of scientific skepticism, financial constraints, ethical concerns, and media sensationalism created an environment in which continuation of the research was simply no longer viable. John began making the painful arrangements necessary to wind down the project, including finding appropriate facilities for the dolphins and transitioning the research staff to other positions. The process of ending the experiment proved to be as emotionally wrenching as anyone who had observed the deep bonds between the researchers and their subjects might have expected. Margaret's final weeks with Peter were marked by what appeared to be mutual understanding that their remarkable cohabitation was coming to an end. Peter's behaviour during this period suggested that he was aware something significant was changing, though he obviously couldn't understand the human world's demands that were forcing the separation. Peter's response to the impending separation was heartbreaking to observe for anyone who had come to appreciate the depth of his relationship with Margaret. As preparations for his relocation began, his behaviour became increasingly agitated and depressed. He refused food for extended periods, showed little interest in the communication exercises that had previously engaged him so completely, and seemed to withdraw into himself in ways that suggested genuine grief at the prospect of losing his human companion. The actual separation, when it finally occurred, was handled as gently as possible, but the trauma was evident for both Margaret and Peter. Margaret reported feeling as though she was abandoning a close friend and collaborator who had trusted her completely, but could not understand the complex social and professional pressures that were forcing them apart. Peter's distress was visible and immediate, and his behaviour in the days following the separation suggested that he was experiencing something very much like what humans would recognise as heartbreak. What happened to Peter after the separation would become one of the most tragic and controversial aspects of the entire Dolphin House story. Relocated to a facility in Miami that lacked the specialised accommodations and intensive human interaction he had become accustomed to, Peter seemed unable to adapt to his new environment. The deep emotional bonds he had formed with Margaret had apparently become so central to his psychological well-being that their severing left him unable to function normally in typical captive dolphin conditions. Within just a few weeks of the separation, Peter's health began to deteriorate rapidly, in ways that alarmed his new caretakers. He refused to eat regularly, showed little interest in interacting with the staff at his new facility, and displayed behaviour that suggested severe depression. Most alarming of all, he began to exhibit what marine mammal experts would later recognise as self-destructive behaviour, refusing to surface for air at regular intervals and seeming to lose the basic survival instincts that had sustained him throughout his life. The end, when it came, was both sudden and inevitable. Peter was found dead in his tank just a few weeks after his relocation, apparently having chosen to stop breathing rather than continue living in a world without the human companionship that had become essential to his existence. The official cause of death was listed as respiratory failure, but those who had observed his decline understood that Peter had essentially died of what could only be called a broken heart. News of Peter's death sent shockwaves through both the scientific community and the broader public that had followed the Dolphin House experiment. For those who had come to appreciate the apparently deep emotional bonds that could develop between humans and dolphins, it represented a tragic conclusion to what had seemed like a beautiful story of interspecies communication and understanding. The idea that a dolphin could form such profound emotional attachments to a human that separation would prove fatal challenged fundamental assumptions about animal consciousness and the nature of emotional bonds between species. Critics of John's research methods pointed to Peter's death as definitive evidence of the dangerous consequences of treating intelligent animals as experimental subjects rather than sentient beings deserving of ethical consideration. The tragedy highlighted the moral complexities of consciousness research in ways that the scientific community was only beginning to grapple with, raising questions about consent, exploitation, and the responsibilities of researchers toward the subjects of their studies that continue to resonate today. For Margaret, Peter's death was a devastating personal loss that she would struggle to process for years to come. The relationship they had shared during their months of cohabitation had been unlike anything in her previous experience, combining elements of friendship, scientific collaboration, and emotional intimacy that defied conventional categories. The knowledge that their forced separation had contributed to Peter's death created a burden of guilt and grief that would profoundly shape the rest of her life. John himself was deeply shaken by Peter's death, recognizing it as both a personal tragedy and a professional catastrophe that would forever taint public perception of his research. The brilliant scientist who had once dreamed of revolutionizing human understanding of consciousness and communication was now faced with the reality that his experimental methods had contributed to the death of one of the most remarkable research subjects he had ever encountered. The broader scientific community's response to Peter's death was swift and decisive. The already tenuous support for John's unconventional research methods evaporated almost overnight, as researchers and funding agencies concluded that the risks and ethical complications of his approach far outweighed any potential scientific benefits. The dolphin communication research that had once seemed so promising was effectively abandoned, not because it had failed to produce results, but because the human and animal cost of those results had proven to be unacceptably high. In the years that followed, John would continue his explorations of consciousness through other means, diving deeper into psychedelic research and isolation tank work, while gradually distancing himself from the mainstream scientific establishment that had rejected his most ambitious project. His later experiments with ketamine and other consciousness-altering substances would make his earlier LSD research seem conservative by comparison, as he pursued increasingly radical approaches to understanding the nature of awareness and reality itself. The legacy of John C. Lilly and his extraordinary dolphin experiments would prove to be as complex and contradictory as the man himself, rippling through scientific circles, popular culture, and public consciousness in ways that continue to fascinate and perplex us decades later. Like a stone thrown into still water, the story of Margaret, Peter, and their flooded house of dreams created concentric circles of influence that spread far beyond the original splash, touching everything from serious academic research to Hollywood films to New Age spiritual movements. In the immediate aftermath of the Dolphin House experiment's tragic conclusion, the scientific establishment seemed eager to forget the entire episode, treating it as an embarrassing footnote to an otherwise distinguished researcher's career. Conference presentations about Lilly's work became increasingly rare. His papers were cited less frequently, and the whole field of interspecies communication research fell into a kind of academic hibernation that would last for decades. It was as though the scientific community had collectively decided that some doors were better left unopened, some questions better left unasked. Yet beneath this surface dismissal, Lilly's work continued to influence researchers in subtle but significant ways. His innovations in neurophysiology and brain mapping techniques remained valuable contributions to legitimate neuroscience, even as his more controversial consciousness research was relegated to the margins of academic respectability. The isolation tank, perhaps his most enduring practical invention, gradually found acceptance in therapeutic and recreational contexts, though few users were likely aware of its origins in one man's quest to understand the deepest nature of consciousness. The broader cultural impact of Lilly's dolphin research proved to be far more substantial and lasting than its immediate scientific reception might have suggested. The story of a woman living with a dolphin, attempting to bridge the communication gap between species through patience, dedication, and ultimately love, captured the public imagination in ways that dry academic papers never could. It became a kind of modern myth, a tale that spoke to humanity's ancient longing to connect with the other intelligences that share our planet. Popular accounts of the Dolphin House experiment, often embellished with romantic speculation and mystical interpretation, spread through the counterculture movement of the late 1960s and early 70s like wildfire through dry grass. The story became entangled with broader themes of consciousness expansion, environmental awareness, and the search for alternative ways of understanding our relationship with the natural world. Dolphins, already regarded with special affection by many people, became symbols of a kind of pure, uncorrupted intelligence that offered hope for communication beyond the limitations of human language and logic. This romanticization of Lilly's work, while often scientifically inaccurate, served an important cultural function by raising public awareness about dolphin intelligence and marine mammal welfare. The tragic fate of Peter became a rallying point for early animal rights activists, who pointed to his death as evidence of the need for more ethical treatment of captive marine mammals. The growing movement to protect dolphins and whales from exploitation drew at least some of its emotional power from the story of a dolphin who had tried to learn human language and died of heartbreak when separated from his human companion. Hollywood, never one to let a good story go unexploited, eventually discovered the dramatic potential of Lilly's research, though the resulting films and television programs often bore only passing resemblance to the actual scientific work. The notion of humans communicating with dolphins proved irresistible to screenwriters and directors, who found in the story a perfect blend of scientific credibility, emotional drama, and mystical possibility. These fictional adaptations, while often wildly inaccurate, helped to keep the basic story alive in public consciousness long after the original research had been forgotten by the academic world. The New Age spiritual movement that emerged in the 1970s and 80s embraced Lilly's work with particular enthusiasm, though they tended to focus more on its mystical implications than its scientific methodology. Dolphins became associated with themes of spiritual awakening, psychic communication, and transcendence of ordinary consciousness. Workshops promising to teach participants how to communicate telepathically with dolphins began appearing at spiritual retreats and consciousness festivals, usually led by teachers who had little or no actual experience with marine mammals, but abundant enthusiasm for their transformative potential. Lilly himself seemed somewhat bemused by this popular appropriation of his work, maintaining a complex relationship with the various movements that claimed him as an inspiration. In his later years, he became something of a countercultural icon, giving lectures at consciousness conferences and spiritual gatherings where he would recount his experiences with dolphins, isolation tanks, and psychedelic drugs to audiences who regarded him as a pioneering explorer of inner space, rather than a disgraced scientist who had lost his way. His continued experiments with consciousness-altering substances became increasingly elaborate and frankly alarming to those who cared about his well-being. Ketamine, which he began using in the 1970s, proved to be even more powerful than LSD in producing profound alterations of consciousness, but it also carried greater risks of psychological damage and physical harm. Lilly's accounts of his ketamine experiences read like dispatches from alien worlds, describing encounters with machine intelligences, journeys through alternate dimensions, and communications with entities that existed beyond the boundaries of ordinary reality. These later explorations convinced Lilly that consciousness was far stranger and more malleable than even his dolphin research had suggested. He developed elaborate theories about the nature of reality, the existence of multiple dimensions, and the possibility of communication with non-human intelligences that lived in realms beyond physical space. To his critics, these ideas provided final proof that his earlier promising career had been derailed by drug use and mystical speculation. To his supporters, they represented the logical culmination of a lifetime spent pushing the boundaries of human knowledge and experience. The scientific community's eventual reassessment of Lilly's dolphin research would come decades later, as new generations of researchers began studying marine mammal intelligence with more sophisticated techniques and greater ethical sensitivity. Modern studies have confirmed many of Lilly's basic insights about dolphin cognitive abilities, demonstrating that these remarkable creatures do indeed possess complex intelligence, sophisticated communication systems, and rich emotional lives that deserve serious scientific attention and ethical consideration. Contemporary researchers, working with wild dolphins in their natural environments rather than captive animals in artificial settings, have documented behaviours that vindicate much of what Lilly claimed to observe in his laboratory studies. Dolphins have been shown to possess self-awareness, as demonstrated by their ability to recognise themselves in mirrors. They use tools, engage in complex social cooperation, and pass cultural knowledge from one generation to the next. Most remarkably of all, they have been observed teaching wild behaviours to human researchers, suggesting a level of interspecies communication that approaches what Lilly had dreamed of achieving. Yet these modern findings also highlight the ethical problems with Lilly's methodology that seemed less apparent in the more permissive research environment of the 1960s. The recognition that dolphins possess sophisticated consciousness makes their captivity for research purposes far more morally problematic than it appeared when they were viewed as merely intelligent animals. The tragedy of Peter's death, understood in light of current knowledge about dolphin emotional complexity, seems even more poignant and preventable than it did at the time. Margaret Howe Lovatt, now in her later years, has occasionally granted interviews about her experiences in the Dolphin House, though she remains largely private about the more personal aspects of her relationship with Peter. Her reflections on the experiment reveal a complex mixture of pride in the scientific breakthroughs they achieved and sorrow for the tragic consequences that followed. She maintains that the communication work was genuine and significant, while acknowledging that the methods used would be considered unacceptable by contemporary standards. The recordings and detailed notes from the Dolphin House experiment remain archived in various research institutions, a treasure trove of documentation about one of the most unusual scientific studies ever conducted. These materials continue to be studied by researchers interested in animal cognition, interspecies communication, and the history of consciousness research, providing insights that influence scientific thinking about animal intelligence and the ethical considerations involved in studying non-human consciousness. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of Lilly's work lies not in any specific scientific discovery, but in the questions it raised about the nature of consciousness and communication. His willingness to imagine that meaningful dialogue between humans and other species might be possible helped to expand our conception of intelligence beyond the narrow boundaries of human experience. The very audacity of his vision, that we might one day engage in philosophical discussions with dolphins, whales, or other intelligent beings, continues to inspire researchers who approach the study of animal consciousness with both scientific rigour and imaginative possibility. The story also serves as a cautionary tale about the importance of ethical considerations in consciousness research. Lilly's genuine scientific curiosity and his remarkable discoveries were ultimately overshadowed by the tragic consequences of methods that prioritized research goals over the well-being of the intelligent beings he was studying. Modern researchers, informed by a deeper understanding of animal consciousness and more developed ethical frameworks, face the ongoing challenge of pursuing knowledge while respecting the rights and dignity of non-human subjects. As we look back on this extraordinary chapter in the history of science, we're left with questions that continue to resonate in our ongoing efforts to understand consciousness, communication, and our relationship with the other intelligent beings that share our planet. What are our obligations toward the creatures we study? How do we balance scientific curiosity with ethical responsibility? What does it mean to truly communicate with another species, and what are we willing to sacrifice, or allow others to sacrifice, in pursuit of that understanding? The dolphins that inspired Lilly's most famous work continue to swim in oceans around the world, their intelligence and consciousness now recognized and protected by laws that reflect our growing understanding of their remarkable cognitive abilities. Whether they retain any collective memory of the strange time when one of their kind tried to learn human language in a flooded house in the Caribbean remains a mystery, locked away in minds that continue to challenge our understanding of intelligence, consciousness, and the possibility of true communication between different forms of awareness. And so, dear listeners, we come to the end of this remarkable tale, a story that began with the highest scientific aspirations and ended with tragedy, loss, and hard-won wisdom about the complexities of consciousness and connection. As you settle more deeply into your pillows tonight, feeling the gentle weight of drowsiness beginning to claim you, perhaps you'll find yourself wondering about the other intelligences that share our world, about the possibility of communication that transcends the boundaries of species, and about the responsibilities that come with reaching across the vast spaces that separate one conscious mind from another. The story of John C. Lilly and his dolphins reminds us that the universe may be far less lonely than we sometimes imagine, filled with minds and hearts and forms of awareness that we're only beginning to understand. In the gentle darkness of your bedroom, as sleep begins to weave its quiet spell around you, you might listen for a moment to the soft sounds of the world settling into night, the distant hum of traffic, the whisper of wind through trees, the quiet rhythm of your own breathing, and wonder what other forms of consciousness might be listening too, reaching across the spaces between us with their own hopes for connection and understanding. Rest peacefully tonight, knowing that even in our isolation, we're surrounded by mysteries and possibilities that continue to unfold in ways we can barely imagine. The dolphins still swim in their vast blue world, carrying with them whatever memories they may have of that brief, strange time when the boundaries between human and dolphin consciousness seemed almost ready to dissolve entirely. And somewhere in that endless ocean, in the space between one breath and the next, the dream of true interspecies communication continues, patient and enduring as the tides themselves. Sweet dreams, gentle souls. Sweet dreams.